Oh, Africa, brave Africa. Once coined the Dark Continent due to its mysterious and unknown nature to the bulk of the world as one of the last fully explored and mapped out continents, and it actually wasn't until relatively recently, the past 150 years, that the rest of the world really understood that Africa was not some desolate jungle wasteland, but actually had culture and civilizations, as well as some of the most interesting human groups the world has to offer. But wait, wasn't Africa known to the Greeks, Romans, Arabians, and even Chinese? Well, it'd be more accurate to call this Africa, the northern and easternmost portions known to the ancient world, as the remainder of the massive continent really was cut off from the rest of the world for tens of thousands of years, effectively creating two main divisions, that being North Africa and the Horn, as well as Sub-Saharan Africa. North Africa, the area typically known to the ancient world as Africa, a word derived from Old Semitic or Berber origin, was quite integrated with the surrounding Mediterranean, with there being many transcontinental empires spanning through Europe and Africa, such as the Vandals or Phoenicians, or Africa and Asia, such as the various Egyptian dynasties, or all three, such as the case with the Roman, Macedonian, and later Ottoman empires. Due to this, there was significant settlement from the Middle East and Europe and North Africa, and as I discussed in my video over Egyptians, Muslim Egyptians have the highest degree of genetic similarity to the Middle East, Algerians generally have the highest degree of genetic similarity to Europeans, while Moroccans, being the most heavily removed, have the purest example of the original North African gene pool and phenotype. Ever since the desertification of the Sahel and much of North Africa several thousand years ago, the civilizations of Eurasia and North Africa had been effectively cut off from Sub-Saharan Africa, but this of course does not mean that there has not been any contact, as of course there has been significant migrations between Arabia and the Horn of Africa, which is sometimes considered to be a part of Sub-Saharan Africa, as well as less major migrations between West and Central Africa, north to and from the Maghreb and Egypt, which is why the natives of North Africa and the Horn are a combination of Sub-Saharan African and Western Eurasian ancestry. However, among modern groups, this is of course highly variable, with groups in the Horn having different levels of admixture from ancient and more recent Eurasian migrants, but are predominantly Sub-Saharan, while North Africans are mostly Eurasian with varying degrees of Sub-Saharan African DNA, as I discussed in my video over the Afro-Asiatic world. The Sub-Saharan component is actually divergent from the same component found in the Nilo-Saharan populations, which can be found in its purest form, of course, in the Nilotic peoples of East Africa, from South Sudan and Ethiopia to Kenya and Tanzania in the south, and chances are you've already seen my video over the Nilotes, by far the most popular video I've ever made, much to my surprise. They are distinct from the more recent Bantu arrivals, and this can be seen even in the present day, with there being relatively little admixture between these groups, although southern Nilotes certainly have more Bantu ancestry than those in the north, in modern South Sudan, who are an example of the purest phenotype, and hence have the most pronounced features. The Maasai, often touted as the most iconic African tribe for their somewhat quirky customs, are actually a combination of Horn African, Bantu, and principally Nilotic extraction, so in a way they are representative of Sub-Saharans as a whole, but even they are not the indigenous peoples of the land they inhabit. Just because Eurasians diverged from Sub-Saharan Africans roughly 60 to 110,000 years ago doesn't mean that those who remained in Africa stopped evolving, as these Africans have split into roughly four main basal divisions, give or take, with the previously mentioned Nilo-Saharan base being endemic to Northeast Africa, while the more well-known Niger-Congo base, and more specifically Bantu descendants, are native to West Africa, and are what are generally known as the typical black African, but they are indeed new arrivals to the lands they inhabit. Before the Bantu expansion, which I've discussed at length in the past, the native inhabitants of Central Africa were the rather primitive pygmy groups of the Congo and parts of East Africa, who spoke an as of now unknown language before adopting a Niger-Congo language after their conquest from the incoming Bantus, and have, for the most part, retained their traditional lifestyles as one of only a handful of hunter-gatherers or foragers in Africa. There was minor intermixing with the Bantu populations, who are undoubtedly highly genetically disparate from the Pygmies, and today there are small numbers of Pygmies throughout the Congo and other parts of East Central Africa. The other hunter-gatherer population of Africa was located predominantly in eastern and southern Africa, and are a group of many diverse peoples known as the Khoi, Kapoid, Bushman, or San, oftentimes coined together as the Khoisan, one of the oldest divergent extended regionalized ancestral continuums of humanity, who split roughly 150,000 years ago, showing the great genetic diversity among so-called Sub-Saharan Africans. There are some claims that a large migration from the Horn intermixed with the Khoisan in southern Africa some thousands of years ago, but these are, as of now, rather shaky, and there is less known about this group than most others in Africa, with the Hadza and Sandawe of Tanzania recognized to be the indigenous inhabitants of the region, oftentimes being grouped with Khoisan due to their genetic isolation from their surrounding peoples and the presence of Klit consonants in their language, a sign typified almost exclusively in Khoi vocabulary. Again, there are trace amounts of Khoisan admixture in many Bantu groups today, perhaps most obviously in the Xhosa ethnicity of South Africa, manifesting in their appearance, culture, and obviously vocabulary, and the Cape Coloreds of the region also have large amounts of Khoisan admixture, roughly 25 to 40%, and hence are thought of by many as the strongest legacy of this group, although many full-blooded individuals still remain in South Africa, Botswana, and Namibia. So basically, think of the Pygmy and the Khoi as the Native Americans of Africa, and there are other groups such as the Dogon in Mali and West Africa that are also thought to have a pre-Niger-Congo origin, but this is disputed. The island of Madagascar is a very unique region of Africa, being a combination of both Austronesian settlers from Borneo and Southeast Asia, Bantu migrants from Southeast Africa, and minor Western Eurasian input from the Middle East, South Asia, and later Europe, but African ancestry is strongest on the western side of the island facing Africa, and appearance and culture is obviously highly irregular, making it, in my opinion, one of the most interesting nations on Earth. Sudan is also a unique case of recent major racial intermixing between the indigenous Kushites, Nubians, and other Nilo-Saharan peoples with incoming migrants from the Arabian Peninsula who have had a large impact on the genetics of the Sudanese population, creating a hybridized nation who identify as Arabs but are actually incredibly ethnically mixed, as most Arabized groups are, only with a sub-Saharan rather than Western Eurasian base. There was a bit of an identity crisis in Sudan in the 20th century between their indigenous Nubian heritage and the more recent Arab culture brought to the country, but eventually the Arab identity won out, despite some parts of Sudan being far more African than Arab, genetically speaking, as we'll soon discuss. Now, due to the very old history of European settlement in southern Africa, many South African, Namibian, Zimbabwean, or Botswana Bantus or Khois may have some significant or minor degree of European, or more rarely East or South Asian ancestry, and by looking at my highly anticipated, by some, map of sub-Saharan African admixture in the continent and surrounding area, it's easy to see just how complicated the situation truly is, as is true for the distribution of Western Eurasian and Eastern Eurasian admixture as well. But now, let's move on to sub-Saharan ancestry outside of the continent of Africa, and elsewhere in the Old World, African ancestry is quite strong, especially in parts of Arabia and the Middle East, such as Yemen, where some estimate that a whopping 50% of maternal haplogroups are of sub-Saharan African origin, either due to intermixing and contact from the Horn, or the extensive history of slavery in the region. But there's also moderate amounts of African descendants in Iran, Iraq, Turkey, and the Gulf Arab states as well. There's a small degree of African admixture in southern Europe, most notably southern Iberia and Sicily, mostly from contact with North African Moors throughout the century, and some African DNA has even reached as far as the Indian subcontinent, from intermixing with Arabs and Horn Africans, as well as the later importation of Bantu slaves. The extent of African ancestry in the Americas, however, really dwarfs that found in Europe and Asia, and as a subject of much interest to myself and others, is a topic I've delved into at length, discussing just how much impact they've had on Northern America, the Caribbean, Hispanic America, and Brazil, and due to its extensive nature, the African diaspora is a topic I'll have to reserve for a future video. But by looking at a brief overview of the continents, it's clear that African admixture is present in just about every single country or territory in the Americas to some extent, with the highest genetic component being in Brazil, where a country of over 200 million people is around 20% Sub-Saharan in DNA, spread out over the different ethnic groups of the country, with a majority of even self-described white Brazilians having some degree of African heritage, and in many other Latin American countries such as Mexico, Colombia, or Venezuela, whites, mestizos, even some Amerindians may have some African blood from far back in their lineage as well, from extensive intermixing during and since the colonial period. So I have to ask the same question that I asked in my videos over Caucasians and Asians, or Western and Eastern Eurasians. Just how much African ancestry does one have to have in order to be considered African or black? In the United States, historically, it was merely one drop of sub-Saharan blood, or later at least 1/64th ancestry, in order to be considered black. But that's a rather loose definition, to say the least, considering around 10% of white Americans have at least 2% African ancestry. But conversely, in Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic, many with significant, and I do mean significant, African ancestry often identify as white and integrate into the white population, which is why self-identified whites from these regions have such a high degree of African admixture. So what's the cutoff? 50%? 20%? 1%? Why is it that someone that is mostly non-African in terms of DNA should be grouped together with full-blooded Africans, as is true for many peoples traditionally considered black in America, Brazil, and Africa itself? Why is society so incapable of understanding nuance or complexity? Saying that race is a social construct or variable or debatable or situational is understandable. But saying that race isn't real or there's no genetic component whatsoever is, well, quite simply not true, as the people of sub-Saharan Africa are very easily distinguished not only in appearance but genetics as the oldest divergent branch of the human species who have mixed with many other groups throughout history. So who exactly is black or African? This is definitely a case where there is no definite cultural answer, but we can certainly measure the sub-Saharan African component in groups throughout Africa and the world to try and gain a clearer picture, which I think this map does quite well. So go ahead and let me know your thoughts on the sub-Saharan Africans and the divisions and intermixing between them and how they've impacted the world. And for today's poll, let me know which African group you'd like to learn more about. And as always, thanks for watching everyone. This has been Mason, and I'll see you next time.